University, and I am the Professional Development Co-Chair for Black in Neuro. For today's webinar, we have live captioning and American Sign Language interpreting available for the event. To turn on the captions on or off, click the CC Live Caption icon along the bottom of your window. You can also adjust the size of the font by clicking on the 3 dots at the bottom of your window that say More and selecting Subtitle Settings. Our sign language interpreter, Ms. Catherine Willett, should appear as a panelist on your screen. If you experience any issues with accessing the caption interpreters, please message to all panelists in the chat.
Keep it on.
I would like to thank our conference sponsors, including the Allen Institute, the Wooside Neuroscience Institute at Stanford, the University of Minnesota Department of Neuroscience and Medical Discovery Team on Addiction, the Alzheimer's Association, Neuroscience, and many more. Without their support, this event would not be possible. So thank you so much to our sponsors for Black in Neuro Week. If you were unable to attend any of the sessions so far for Black in Neuro Week, check out our YouTube page where all of our events from today and the rest of Black in Neuro Week are either available now or will be shortly posted. Additionally, we want to share any highlights from what you've learned today on social media. So please do so using the hashtag BINW22 or 22 and hashtag NeuroRacism. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you today from Manhattan, a borough of New York City, land of the Lenape First Peoples. There is a myth that the Dutch purchased Manhattan Island from the Lenape in 1626, which created a forced migration from their homeland. As we know, Westernized history rarely recognizes the true stories of Indigenous people that were brutally removed from their ancestral homelands. The Lenape are the true native New Yorkers, and after nearly 400 years, deserve to reclaim their land. We are all joining this event from places around the world, and so I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the lands you are joining from, as well as your relationship to those lands and to the Indigenous people who have and continue to inhabit them. So we'll just take a moment to acknowledge that. Also, in honor of our 3rd annual Black in Neuro Week, we are offering a discounted code at 10%, which was just posted in the chat. So feel free to get some Black in Neuro merch. Keeping with the tradition, today's panel of researchers, clinicians, and patients will discuss how racism translates into misdiagnoses or lack of diagnosis in neurological and psychiatric disorders, and how we can effectively combat these issues. Today, we are honored to have our panel speakers, Ms. Rihanna Patterson from the Dominica Dimension Foundation, Dr. William Lawson with the Institute for Reducing Racial Disparities, Dr. Jennifer Singh with Georgia Institute of Technology, and Bernadine Okeke of IMALS. Thank you all for joining us today. So excited to hear from you all. And we will shift our focus into some of the questions. So I want to hear from each of the panelists. What is the focus of your current work and/or research in relation to psychiatric disorders and neurodegenerative disorders? And we'll start that off with Dr. Lawson.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to note that I've long been interested in the problem of diagnosis and misdiagnosis, especially the way of access to treatment services. Currently, we are funded to begin to look at various ways of treating these disorders, but first we have to develop new ways to be able to identify, especially in different populations, people of color, linking that, and I've been more interested in the phenomenology, the genetics, as well as treatment outcomes for psychopharmacology.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, addressing those health disparities are so important. So I'm looking forward to learning more about the work that you do. I'll now go over to Ms. Bernadine Okeke.
That's right. Oh, I am a person living with ALS, which is a neurodegenerative disease. And I am working extensively with the group called IMALS, and specifically with a subgroup called Many Shades of ALS, which focuses on people of color who have ALS and are We are trying to advocate a faster, better diagnosis, teaching our neurologists how to recognize that Black people get ALS too, and that it actually affects younger and younger populations. So we're a major advocacy group on trying to get new drugs approved, expanded clinical trials. We have an extensive legislative group who try to force senators to look at issues, and we work with the Veterans Administration because it's known that a larger proportion of vets are diagnosed with ALS for whatever reason. So we are in the field, and I am a person living with ALS.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. We'll now go over to Dr. Jennifer Singh.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you, Tiago and Paige, for the invitation to be here, and those in Black and Neuro for organizing this great week. My name is Jennifer Singh, and I'm a sociologist at Georgia Tech, and my research studies intersectional inequities in autism services, specifically among Black families who have a child diagnosed with a developmental disability, and more specifically autism. I've been studying the phenomena of autism for over 15 years now, and more recently have been focused on an ethnography that identifies barriers, structural, economic, social, cultural barriers to diagnosis, and especially services, especially for these lifelong conditions. And so this has spun out into many different projects, which I'm hoping to share with you all today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singh. And last but not certainly least, Brianna Patterson, love to hear from you.
Thanks, Paige. Lovely to be here. So my research has been on the perspectives of people from Dominica on dementia. So that is kind of like my area of interest. And most recently, I've kind of shifted my focus to talk about ageism in the media. I think it's definitely an area that we don't really talk about as we should, but I think it's very important because the media has an effect on our perspectives, positive and negative connotations towards dementia. So that is kind of like what I'm now looking into.
Thank you so much for sharing. And also for all of the audience members, if you do have any questions throughout the panel, feel free to drop those in the Q&A box and we'll make sure to get to them. So the root or the stigma around mental health and psychiatric disorders and conditions can be traced back to slavery. And what are your perspectives on the stigma of seeking psychiatric services within the Black community in today's age? And that's a question for any of the panelists to answer. Oh, Dr. Lawson, you're currently muted.
Some of these issues can be related to slavery, and it was thought that African Americans simply did not develop mental disorders. More recently, we accepted the idea that mental disorders exist, but usually we were thought that we did not get depressed, that we did not commit suicide, and the only disorder that was associated with African Americans often was schizophrenia and antisocial personality. And this has had a tremendous impact in terms of access to services, as well as where people ultimately get their services. One of the issues is how do you get these services now? Go where African Americans have turned to, and that is the church, unfortunately, the correctional system, and we need to do more to be able to recognize and screen individuals in those settings.
I'd like to add too, we just did a review of stigma of mental health in the African American communities and just trying to see how that might relate to childhood conditions like autism. And denial is clearly one expression of stigma, this belief. And I love that Rihanna talked about the media, because the way in which autism is presented in the media as a white, male, condition, that there's not this idea that it could possibly happen to Black families. And that translates to how caregivers might perceive inappropriate behaviors. And it actually, there's actually quantitative population data that shows that children are diagnosed with different conditions that are more negative, like conduct disorder, for example, as opposed to something that might be different, like autism. And so the trajectories are different, that happen clearly from that. The denial can exist among the parents themselves, but also community members, because of some of this misperception, or just this idea that parents are bad parents, right? And that they're not, teaching their kids or disciplining their children correctly. And then, there's these stereotypes that are associated with young children, young Black children, that they're loud or that they're, angry. And so these are all embedded in the ways in which we think about people, and how that affects stigma, how it affects some of these denial processes that parents and families and community members might embrace.
I think it also kind of brings about, I guess, shame and guilt and doubt. And also, I think bringing up that emotion of fear, it's kind of like, okay, when I get diagnosis, are people still want to socialize with me? Is my workplace, going to really take me on after this? It's that kind of fear of, and I guess it intertwines with the slave mentality as well. Like, it's just another reason why people will just exclude us even further. So I think it's really going along the lines of that connotation. And it's not really on the lines of, if I get this diagnosis, then I can get treatment, I can, learn to deal with my disorder and not see it as a burden. So I think it's definitely a lot of rejigging. And I think, back to the media, is also having positive images in the media that the system will help us, because we know that the system can fail us. So we need to have stories of hope, stories of triumph, stories that, even though people have a mental health condition, they can live well with it once they've got the right provisions, the right support, the right community there to champion on them and support them, which is why I really like Black in Neuro's community, because that's exactly what we do. And then, having to amplify these key messages, we will get our message across that, we can change narrative. And lived experience is true experience. And, we will start to unlearn some of these things that we've been brought up with. So I think that is kind of like the interlink between mental health and the slave trade.
I definitely agree with all of that. I think so many of us have the perception that, okay, Black, we're Black, that's one negative in society. Now you add on this condition and that's going to further isolate me. And so there's a lot of stigma around that in our communities that I hope that we can eventually address and take on head on, because there's nothing wrong with having these conditions. We just need to know how to treat them effectively. And so going into that and focusing on that, there's so many structural inequities and also a lack of cultural sensitivity that could make it hard for Black folks to seek services. And that could be a lack of access to healthcare, lack of community-based interventions, or geographic issues. Maybe you're not located close to a clinic or a hospital that could potentially treat you or help you. So how do we address these inequities so there's more accessibility for Black people? And I'll start with Bernie here. Oh, you're currently muted.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Speaking from experience in this space, Black people are not supposed to have ALS. It is an old white male disease. So we're supposed to have everything else. So it took me 2 years to get a proper diagnosis for ALS. I was diagnosed with a sports injury when I played tennis. And then I was diagnosed with something called chronic inflammatory demyelinating neuropathy. And I spent a year and a half taking infusions to help improve this. And finally, my neurologist said, I can't handle this. And I ended up at the University of Florida. And then I ended up in Boston and finally got the ALS diagnosis. So I think mainly here, neuroscientists need to understand that these diseases do not have ethnic or ethnicity connotations. That really and truly we should be looking at the symptoms first, not the person, and not make assumptions that because you're Black, you don't fit into this category, or because you're Black, you don't fit into that category. And because we as Black people do not seek out medical intervention or speak out, our communities are not equipped, let me put it that way, to handle many of the more rare diseases. Every doctor can treat you for diabetes, but I have to drive 150 miles to find the nearest ALS clinic at first. Some of my members in many shades of ALS have actually moved from one state to another to find an ALS clinic that can handle their issues. So I think that there are many biases because they're not taught in medical school, or the Black and Neuro community needs to do a little bit more with the sensitization of these physicians, et cetera, so that we stop putting people in buckets and actually look at the symptoms and then try to find a proper diagnosis.
I absolutely agree with that. We definitely need to desensitize our communities and make sure there's more access to these facilities and services that are close. I'll hand it over to Dr. Lawson to give his perspective. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I agree. And not only do we have a problem, am I still muted?
Nope, you're all good.
Yeah, not only do we have a problem in terms of that, but there are huge disparities in our communities in terms of access to services. One of the big ones, of course, is that many of our communities have been redlined, where limited resources are put in. And one of the areas that we often have is the absence of hospitals and specialty care. And I've seen such major cities as Washington, D.C., Austin, Texas, some of the wealthiest places in the country. Yet around the African-American community, it's simply not many or no hospitals, and definitely not the kind of specialty care that is needed. So there's some primary care, but specialty care for mental health services, for ALS, for a whole host, for autism, for others, it's just not there. So even if people could recognize that they have a problem, they wouldn't have the transportation or other services to be able to get to the specialties where they are.
Definitely. That access to transportation is also a major issue. Dr. Singh, what are your perspectives on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about the structural inequities that are shaping the disparities that we see in all these different kinds of conditions that are being discussed today. And I think part of the issue is we first need to ask different questions in the research that we do. Dr. Lawson talked about transportation, so if we think about the structure and where people live, and certainly Bernadine talks about driving an hour, I started mapping out the services in Georgia, and it's distributed so unequally it's blatant, and so, I was hoping that I could create something where people could identify services, but really it was just showed more and more how unequal the services are. And so I started a working group to really think interdisciplinary about this, where all members are at the table to really think about how we can first identify what structural racism is and how it's shaping these inequalities. So we look at science, we look at, cultural representation in the media, representation just in who is treating people, right? Who is diagnosing? I mean, we see inequality in terms of that type of representation, and certainly the structure. If we look at residential segregation, that maps on perfectly to where the distribution of services are. So we first need to define the biggest issue and really start thinking how we can target those structural intervention, increasing diversity of practitioners and researchers, having public service announcements that, folks who are Black do have developmental and psychiatric and issues, and that it's real and that it shouldn't be something that we hide, right? To go back to what others have been talking about, teaching racial bias training to teachers, clinicians, teaching them how to have humility, cultural humility, structural humility. I mean, the list goes on and on, thinking of just about our public school systems as well, since for a lot of the families that I talk to, that is where they get their services. And, and if that structure doesn't exist, even though it's mandated by the law, it is not going to be helpful for families. So I think there's a lot of ways we can think about it. But the first is just defining the problem in different ways.
Thank you so much for that. Rihanna?
Yeah, I think I would echo what Jennifer said as well, and just add a few more bits. I think we definitely need more representation. There's a lot of policies and white papers being unfolded, and we have no one living with dementia on the board. We have no one living with dementia being consulted about, but these papers and these policies, that we don't even know are going to be acted upon or not, are being in place. I think we definitely need more people with lived experience to bring their insights, their knowledge, because they are the ones that are the real experts here. They live day in, day out, So I think we need to have more representation, definitely, when it comes to policies, when it comes to research, in a more authentic way. And then I would also say we need to diversify the curriculum. We need to see more Black academics, more Black researchers being talked about in schools and universities, because it's very important. And that's just one way of kind of, raising awareness that we exist and that we matter. And there are treatments out there for us that are being conducted by us. So that is also something else that we also need to tap into. I think also destigmatizing mental health in the media, as I said before, very, very important, and more holistic treatments towards dementia as well. We talk about quite invasive treatments in most research papers, but I think it's very important that we also do a bit more non-invasive as well, because especially in the Black community, we love our teas, we love our little remedies, and these things actually work. And we need to really kind of focus on that a bit more, because these things are what we know, but having a bit more data and a bit more backing and more concrete understanding of the explanation as to why these remedies work would also be very helpful as well. And then what else would I say? I think more specialized professionals in roles. I can't speak on the entire nation, but in Dominica, we only have about 3 generalists in the country who deals with dementia. So I think there definitely needs to be more representation in that matter and more support for people to get to a point that they can be specialized. So that is something else to look into. And then I think my last key thing would also be waiting lists. The process it takes to get a diagnosis, the process it takes to get some level of treatment, some level of care, attention, some recognition, some acknowledgement. It's too long, and it's not productive at all to anyone, because you've got something that's urgent, but you're it takes 3 weeks, months even to get a response back, not even an email, to follow up. I think we can do better. We can definitely do better in that area. And yeah, the more people wait, the worse the condition gets, and it's just not productive for anyone. So there needs to be some kind of procedure to allow us to tend to people as urgent. We don't have to call emergencies to get urgent treatment. There needs to be some other practicalities and provisions in place.
I absolutely agree with you there, especially right now as we're undergoing the COVID-19 crisis. Healthcare, access to healthcare for folks has been very, very difficult to access. Being able to get an appointment and go in for treatment right away. There's so many issues with being able to do that. And those disparities were already there prior to the pandemic, and they're only going to be exacerbated because of what we're seeing in our healthcare system. So that is a great point. We've talked about—
Can I make a point also here? And that is that due to these delays that Rihanna is talking about, and the delays that we have experienced as a person living with the disease, not basically researching it, what we find is because there are many clinical trials out there for different medications, etc., many Black people are excluded from participating in these clinical trials because these symptoms have been in existence for so long before the diagnosis that they are outside of the perimeter, which would allow them to qualify, myself included. So you will find that you're basically just kind of holding your hands and waiting. And, in my case, ALS is a terminal illness. It is without a cure. And there's only one drug that has been approved for it in the past 17 years. So we are finding that we're becoming very vocal as a result of this. I mean, we tell people we do not have the time or the luxury of going through all of these phase 1, phase 2, phase 3.1, phase 4, phase whatever to get drugs into the market. And since we know it's our choice, we need to move faster. And we find that many Black people, as a result, miss this entire opportunity, and therefore they're dying faster. I throw that out there.
Let me make a quick point about that as well. You mentioned the point about finding the new treatments. We're involved, as I said, in using odorants to try to improve dementia. It's an area that's not been used before. Unfortunately, there are other products in the environment that may be helpful. But unfortunately, the ones that folks usually get are those that are heavily marketed, not FDA approved by large companies. And so they end up using things that are worthless. And at the same time, potentially useful things are never researched at all.
Yeah, I wanted to just add, thank you, Bernadine. The inclusion of racial and ethnic minorities in research is essential, and community-based participatory research as we move forward and thinking about, neuroscience and the conditions associated with the brain, but also, linking it back to slavery and linking it back to the abuse that has developed mistrust in different communities throughout the world, right? Who do not want to be part of the medical establishment. And so building those layers of trust are really going to require inclusion on these fronts, and Tuskegee is one example, but that's only one example. There are so many more. Read Harriet Washington's book if you want to learn more about the abuse of Black bodies for experimentation. Has created this level of mistrust, and so there's a reason why people don't want to participate in research. But it is essential to include, to be part of that process, so that your situation is taken into consideration. And this is something we really think about as well when we're thinking about services. Do they need, services in the evening time? Do they need childcare? Do they need transportation? Are they a single parent? All of these things that are going to shape whether or not someone can go and do what is required or presumed to be, available to people.
Let me just make one quick point about the Tuskegee thing. Again, it is the impact far beyond research. because there's a major predictor of whether or not people have physician mistrust and will go in for health treatment at all. And unfortunately, too many people got the wrong message. Tuskegee was not giving treatment to people of color. It was depriving people of treatment. Yet much of the interpretation is we got to be very suspicious about any kind of new advances or treatments to be brought into our communities.
Yes, all incredible points. Like mistrust definitely plays a big role in us seeking services. And science has not done right by us, and I hope that can definitely change. That book is called Medical Apartheid for folks that are on the call. It's a hard read, but it's a necessary read. And so going into how we've been talking about culture and cultural mistrust, I'm interested on you all's perspectives on the intersections between culture and genetics and the under and overrepresentation of psychiatric diagnoses in the Black community. Starting with Dr. Singh.
So yeah, this is a big question. And I wrote a book about genetics and autism. And, you know, this project really examined various stakeholders and, you know, based on the rise and the social consequences of this massive amount of investment in finding a gene for autism. Well, there is no gene for autism. That's the short story, right? But one of the main takeaways, because there's no one autism, and, you know, that goes into the way in which we categorize, count, and define conditions are very, very much socially constructed, right? And who is part of that pile of people, or who is part of those constructions shapes what we think and understand about that, those conditions. But one of the takeaways is that by viewing autism through this genetics lens, it really tends to obscure the social. It obscures the structural inequalities that shape how we know what a condition is like autism, how people experience it, especially for people living with autism, like the inclusion of people who actually are experiencing it and their families. And, you know, despite my persistent questions with families to ask about genetics, that was not what they cared about. What they cared about was how they were going to access their next service, how they were going to get what they needed for their child to succeed and fulfill, you know, what they can do in their life, you know, throughout their lifetime. And unfortunately, this scientific culture is very preoccupied with genetics. It doesn't matter if it's autism or dementia or ALS. This is sort of the target of knowledge that we want to investigate. And it doesn't explain the complexity of these conditions and how social structure, how racism, how sexism are shaping who gets defined in these particular conditions. So we really need to think more critically, obviously, and others can probably speak more to how it reifies this idea that race is genetic, right? That if we just start counting or looking for genes in you know, Black populations, that we will find a gene for autism because it's in a particular group, while we forget that these categories of people are socially constructed, right? And they have meanings that are shaped by it. I'll let others add to that.
Yeah, I want to add to that, and also we make this artificial distinction between genetic and environment. My own research has shown that factors such as early development and early stress can interact with the genetics for bipolar disorder. And that's been true for a lot of other disorders. The early childhood trauma can be as important as other factors in terms of diagnosis of mental disorders. Also, a recent study showed that Alzheimer's, which we've just had tremendous emphasis, millions of dollars going in terms of the genetics of it, and yet 40–50% of the occurrence of it is related to environmental factors that are modifiable, that we can change the living conditions that folks have, that we can do more to help prevent the occurrence of Alzheimer's, rather than simply seeing if we can find a genetic marker that we can modify.
I would definitely like to add on to that, especially on the dementia point. I think definitely research has shown that dementia can be genetically linked. And even further to that, I think research has also looked into how dementia is linked also to gender as well, and even generations. For example, maybe the second generation might not get it, but it might be the fourth or the fifth or the sixth. So it definitely, there is some strong relationship between that. And then even when it comes to culture as well, a lot of people call dementia senile dementia or senility, which was a term that was used way back in the day, but is now coming back into play. And you see that even with doctors who are maybe, in their 50s or 60s, and they grew up with, hearing senility. So even them, when they can't get a diagnosis, they'll just put senile dementia. I've seen it, even my own grandfather has a diagnosis of senile dementia. And you're just like, what is that? That's not an actual term. It's a stigmatized term that has been used, and it's not helpful for anyone because you can't categorize that as anything. I mean, there's 100 types of dementia, but senile dementia is definitely not one of them. So it's not helping when it comes to research and when it comes to statistics, because you cannot put that in a box. So we need to be very clear and kind of definitely do some inner work to change our perspectives and things that we've learned in our childhood to get to a point where we're just using new knowledge and new information that we've learned in recent times, because that is literally what it is now. And then even when we come with the term elderly is okay, it's an okay term, but some people would prefer older people. But it's because we always use the term elderly. We say elderly all the time, and then there's other connotations to elderly, there's vulnerable, there's this, that, the other, that we've also been so absorbed in through the media. And that creates a further problem as well. So I think there is definitely some, or I should say a very strong interlink between culture and genetics and how we approach research and how we approach people with mental health conditions, most definitely. These perspectives have been ingrown in us since the beginning.
My small contribution to this issue has to do with genetics also in ALS. 90% of those of us who are diagnosed with ALS, it is sporadic. It just comes out of the blue. We do not have a family history, or we do not know anyone with it. The first time my family heard of ALS was when I got it. And I mean, so no one heard it. Only about 10% of those diagnosed with ALS, it's family-based. And the genetic research around that has been focusing on the SOD gene, that is a family passed down gene. But what we're finding is we need more and more genetic research to determine why the sporadic ALS occurs in the first place, and then how it affects different people, because ALS can actually be limb onset, bulbar onset. You can have it where it stops you from talking and breathing before it stops you from moving. And I do not think a lot of research is going into this space, except, when you have small communities like ours pushing for the research. But we have to go beyond being black and white, but we actually have to look at a deeper connotation as to why, neurodegenerative diseases occur. And it's not just ALS, it's MS, and it's the whole gamut of motor infirmities, as well as the psychiatric one.
Absolutely. I think so many of the things that you all said are so relevant and important, considering environment and how that ties into the likelihood of these conditions, that history plays such an important role, and also language, making sure we're using the appropriate language to talk about these conditions. And so I want to kind of shift into support systems. And so we've talked about neurodiversity and neurodegenerative diseases and how to try to effectively combat those issues. But receiving that diagnosis can be daunting for the patient and also the families of that patient who are trying to support or help that person who has the diagnosis. So what are some necessary systems that should be in place to support these families that are already feeling so marginalized?
Can I start with that one? Because that's a real pet peeve for me.
Absolutely.
I keep saying ALS is a terminal illness, so we need mental counseling as well as the physical support as we decline, because at the end of the day, an ALS patient will become completely paralyzed and have to be totally dependent on other people for their day-to-day living. And most of the time, an ALS patient will die due to respiratory failure. But what we are realizing is that our physicians just are not equipped with the ability to tell a patient that you have ALS. You'll be amazed at how the physician just doesn't want to deliver that diagnosis in the first place, because it's really depressing. And when a family who does not have the resources, because this is an expensive disease, do not have the resources to carry you down the road, then your quality of life crashes significantly. I mean, I still spend half of my time in Lagos, Nigeria, which is in the West African coast. And I'm actually talking to you from there right now. And I spend the other half of my time in Orlando, but I'm still able to fly. But there will come a day when we will be looking at respirators and wheelchairs and so on and so forth. Where is the support system for that? And then where's the support system for the caregivers? Because their jobs are extremely stressful. And believe it or not, you'll find a lot of ALS patients in a divorce, and then their patients are in hospice or something like that, because the spouse just can't handle the stress. Mm-hmm.
I just want to, again, make the point that all too often we're in settings in which we just don't recognize mental and neurological disorders. African Americans are much more likely to end up in the correctional system, where this treatment is punitive rather than helpful. People still will not accept the idea that substance abuse disorders can be treated and can be treated by providers. We recognize that it can be lethal to end up in the correctional system. People with mental disorders are much more likely to be shot by police than people who do not. And those who are African American have a double whammy and being shot by police because they're Black and because they're in that system. I was on a subway recently when I saw a gentleman who had autism having a meltdown. Police immediately grabbed him, threw him off the train, handcuffed him, mashed him to the ground, and said, "Wait, this man is not a criminal. He has a disorder that needs to be treated with compassion." So one of the first things we need to do is to make sure that these systems, the correctional system, the screening techniques to identify people who need treatment. And then the next thing we need to do is to make sure that those who come into contact with them are in fact trained to be able to manage them, at least acutely, to give them the care. And then to work with family members to do more for mental health awareness, neurological awareness, so that they recognize that these are not something that's out of, as I've seen folks say, out of the science fiction movies or superstition, or even evil things sent out of the Bible, but disorders that often can be treated and sometimes prevented if we recognize them early enough. The work now showing that we can intervene early in schizophrenia and completely change the course is an important one. And yet there has not been a groundswell of attempts to get this kind of information and interventions in terms of mental health treatments, and leading to tremendous economic costs for the country as a whole, and individuals having conditions that, again, brings them at risk for long-term restrictions as well as being shot.
I couldn't agree more, honestly. there's so much I could talk about, but I think 3 things I'll definitely mention is, I guess, one of the reasons why we have mistreatment in public hospitals or just in private care in general is being understaffed. That's definitely something that we've also seen in the UK as well. The NHS not being able to, pay for their own cost of living, and they've got to seek other career opportunities, for their families. And there's so much going on outside of the profession that is causing people to leave the public system. So when you have an issue of understaff, then you can see how they've been trying to make provisions, but not in the best way possible. I say this because I've seen a lot of situations where there's misuse of restraints, on patients, and that can do more harm than good. So there is a way of dealing with when it comes to restraints, but yeah, you have to make sure that this restrainment is not actually doing more harm than it should be. So I think there needs to be a high level of safeguarding for patients when it comes to things like understaff, or, if just the staff members can't be bothered, there needs to be some level of attention there to kind of figure out what's the real reason why these people are not being treated as people, because they are people at the end of the day. They're more than their disorder. They're a person. There's someone's grandmother, someone's grandfather, an auntie, an activist. There's more to the person than the mental health condition. So we need to look at it as that. We need to be more humane when it comes to, dealing with someone with a mental health condition. Another thing I would say, in the Dominica Dementia Foundation, we've got Dominica Dementia Friends program, which has been adapted from the Alzheimer's Society, where we train people to become dementia friend champions. And this is something that can be done anywhere in the world. If you speak to your local Alzheimer's Society. So having more knowledge, people will be more understanding towards someone who has dementia, and they'll know how to take care of them or take action if needed. So I think, yeah, definitely sharing the knowledge is a very powerful way of, ensuring that people know how to take care of their family members or their friend or whoever is dealing with the situation. And then also having support groups that they can go to, where families can express, what's going on in the home, and they don't feel shamed and they feel acknowledged. And it's also not just healing, but also being able to share resources that works for our community. It's really powerful when you have these support group networks as well. So that's what I would say on that matter.
Yeah, I would reinforce what everybody has been saying here. In the work that I've been doing, we just did a study that looked at care coordination. So when you're dealing with complex human conditions, you're coordinating a lot of different care: medical, therapeutic, educational services for children, right? Our fragmented healthcare system in the United States really and the limited coverage of services, especially in states that don't coordinate these types of services, like the state that I live in, like Georgia. We need more coordination. We need support groups that target the specific. I talk to families who are single parents. And they're like, I go to these groups, they don't know what I'm going through, right? That it takes everything to be there. You need childcare at these support services. You need transportation, and then you need the time to do it. I mean, I'm hoping that with COVID, that maybe some of this telehealth, some of this shift towards the interaction, that we can maybe benefit from what we've learned through this process. That there are situations where maybe we can do it virtually, and that accessibility might actually open up. So I'm hopeful there. When I talk to families, they tell me, because of the inequalities we see based on geography, let's do mobile therapy units. We're already doing this. Let's integrate it into a more inclusive, communities. Telehealth options, obviously, offering services in the evenings and on the weekends, especially for people who work full time. It's just not reasonable. And then, creating for all of these conditions, there's so many professionals, there's so many types of treatment, there's a whole lexicon, a whole new language that needs to be translated. And so really having that, you know, this is what a developmental pediatrician is, this is what an occupational therapist is, this is what a physical therapist, this is what X, Y, and Z, but having it in multiple languages and then using your resources with communities to make sure that they're translatable. And so, I mean, there's so much we can do, I think, in the immediate to really help with when it comes to creating more access.
Absolutely. This discussion has been so insightful, and we have lots of audience questions. So for the remainder of time, we'll shift into those. So one question comes from an audience member saying, does misunderstanding prevent the Black community from seeking the right treatment? If this changed, do you think we would be more likely to ask for help? And that's for anybody to answer.
Well, we found that it's very important in terms of people having health seeking. They recognize that mental illness is not something that will end up having you hospitalized for life. Makes a big difference in terms of willingness to treat. To recognize that virtual treatment is a possibility and that you don't have to travel 100 miles to be in contact with a health professional. And also that medications and other treatments can have been tested if it's FDA approved, but that interventions like drugs of abuse simply don't show the kind of benefits that we can with standardized treatments. And what we found is that just having people recognize this makes a big difference and also prevents them from death, from contributing to the tremendous problem of overdose deaths that we're seeing in our community.
I would add, you know, in the research that I've been doing with families who have children with a developmental condition, they want answers. They want to know what they can do, but it's the structural inequities that are sort of inhibiting them from getting what they need. And so I think there's definitely a form of denial and maybe resistance, but I also see the other side of it where families are like, I'm going to do everything I can to get my son, my daughter, the treatment they need, even if it means taking another job while they're in therapy, you know, even if it means if it's my grandchild, right? So that, you know, I mean, so I mean, I do feel if we make it more inclusive, if we make research, if we include a more diverse public health clinical force, you know, that we would see some of these openings and more perspectives that are going to shape better understanding of, you know, mental health, psychiatric conditions.
I completely agree. And I definitely echo what Jennifer said. Just like autism, with dementia, there's 100 types. But sometimes we just focus on Alzheimer's disease, but then frontotemporal is there, Parkinson's is there, and it's being overlooked. So we need to have more, like a wide variety of research for everyone that's experiencing dementia in different ways, because that is how we will solve what's going on.
Just want to add to that, we've stepped around the issue of structural racism. This can't be a positive, it cannot be a passive process. And that is how I think structural racism is an important, impactful process. When we brought in such issues as critical race theory and others, and start presenting these, there's a counter-push from folks who have other points of view. Often have more resources and have control to be able to address this. And we've seen this repeatedly in terms of getting better care for the mentally ill, treatment for substance abuse, and also getting resources and hospitals and providers into areas in which people of color are. So it's not just passively, oh, gee, we'll just go out and grab some folks and put them in these places or provide information. It's going to be overwhelmed by a counter approach that is much more political, acceptable in some circles, and also much more resource-wise in terms of making laws to be able to address these issues. Again, the battle in terms of the Affordable Care Act, the tremendous resistance in terms of Medicaid and Medicare, I think shows that, again, this cannot be addressed passively. It must be addressed by a sustained process of ongoing advocacy that has to be ongoing, or advantages and gains will be quickly reversed.
I just wanted to add to that. I am such a supporter of this, and I guess that's why we are very happy at IMALS, because this is where we really focus. We have pushed the legislation with the senators. We write letters, and we, for drug trials and releasing drugs on time, et cetera. And it is, I guess, less so, we feel the racism also, but because we're such a small group, our discrimination is due to numbers and the rareness of our disease. So no one wants to pay attention because it is not financially profitable to really force drugs for those of us with ALS. And that's another area I think you guys should take a look at, is the fact that rare diseases tend to be overlooked because the numbers are not there to create the focus. But death is death, and it affects the families regardless. So I think one of the things that Black and Neuro can look at going forward is how we focus on the all of these trials, that we're working towards. Absolutely. I think that's important.
Absolutely. I know we're running short on time. There's one really good question that I want to throw out to everybody. And we'll try to quickly answer this one. What suggestions do you have on recruiting Black people and people of color for research trials? One was specific to recruiting POCs for ALS research. So if you can just give a quick spiel on what are your thoughts on that? And then hopefully we can have more engagement on social media on this topic.
Well, can I start with that?
Absolutely.
I think it's a matter of getting the information out there. People do not know. Again, like I said, ALS clinics are few and far between. So getting clinical trials, getting the diagnosis on time so that you fit the parameters for the trial to begin with. So it's all about getting the information out there. That's my short answer.
Yeah, but researchers need to work with community organizations like Bernadine's, right? They need to work with the very people who have invested interest in this, because without the trust and relationship and partnership with organizations outside of medical industrial complexes, it's not going to help. I mean, I'm a researcher from Georgia Tech. Let me come and do my research with my research question. No, that's not the way we should be doing this research, right? It should be very inclusive, and it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. Those relationships take time. And so if you're invested and you're in this, it's going to take time, but I think it'll be well worth the effort. But you have to build relationships, build trust, and be authentic and inclusive in the kinds of questions you're asking and the kinds of research that you're doing.
I think that's such a beautiful response and a great way for us to end this amazing panel. I want to thank you all for being present for this and providing your perspectives. It was so insightful, and I'm sure the audience will agree with all of the reactions we've been seeing pop up on Zoom. I want to thank you again to our conference sponsors, and also a big thanks to our live captioner and our sign language interpreter, Catherine Millette. As a reminder, this and all events will be available on our YouTube page. If you haven't seen them yet, or if you haven't yet, join the conversation on social media using the hashtag BINW22 and hashtag NeuroRacism. We're at Black and Neuro across all platforms. For the most to-date information on the conference, please check out our conference booklet and or our website. Also today for NeuroRacism, we'll be having a journal club at 5:00 p.m. on addressing racial and phenotypic bias in human neuroscience methods by Dr. Jasmine Kwasa. So if you would like to attend that event, please register and come through, read the paper. And I want to thank everybody again and hope to see you all at the rest of our events.